probably many people listening in may have lots of feelings about, lots of thoughts.
Yeah, for we're going to be talking about generational trauma and how that plays out, how it impacts people's lives, and it's kind of poignant right now with a lot of the things that's been in the news lately. Out in BC, there was that residential school that they found. I think it was about 250 children, in an unmarked mass grave there. um, there's been a lot of Islamophobia stuff that's happened in the last week, and the residue of systemic racism, all kinds, and even going as far back as we could talk about slavery and what that impact has been. And so um, people, some people are living now and they're just thinking, I'm living my life, this has nothing to do with me.
Mhm.
And but there's an impact that all of these things have. And so we're going to be talking today a little bit about this. And by all means, if you have any thoughts or comments or anything, you can hit us up on iLive YouTube channel, and I'll try to get some of those thoughts or comments in. Yeah, Valerie, do you see a lot? Do you have these types of conversations in your sessions?
Yeah, you know what? I think the news definitely gets brought up quite a bit. So more recently, the bodies of those 215 children being found.
Mm.
Something that recently a lot of my clients have spoken about, and I think that's a whole other conversation why people may not speak about it. But definitely a lot of conversations around what does systemic racism look like? You mentioned the idea of slavery. How does that play into people's lives presently? Islamophobia, absolutely. That's something that I speak with clients about all the time, for sure.
So when we talk about, um, okay, let's it's such a big big hard place to start. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm a Black man, I'm
Yes.
a person of color, and
Yeah.
the I've had many conversations with other Black people about, we can see the the I guess you could say the dotted line from the historical impact of slavery within the Black community. We can
Hmm.
see how that's played out in our everyday lives today, and then we can also see, whether we're talking about police brutality or housing challenge, discrimination, so many different things that is played out. Whether it's through our music, it's been expressed in many different ways. Um, but some people are just oblivious to it, and they just think, it's almost like they were born yesterday.
Hmm.
In a
I
way.
was act Yeah, I was reading an article actually earlier today. I think it was provincially based, that there were some public servants who were speaking out. I don't know if you read it, about some systemic racism that's happened in the public sector. Not being able to, more like anti-Black racism, I should be specific. Not getting promotions, not getting time off, all these things. And I read through the comments. That's I don't know about you, but that's where I like to go to, is start reading some of the comments that people are saying underneath. I find that interesting.
Yeah, I
And
did hear about that. I did hear about that, and you know, it's I don't know. It's to me, it's really it's kind of double edged. On one hand, it's great that there's some exposure
yeah.
that's happening with this, but on the other hand, it's like, come on already.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's almost like uh, the problem exists, and for years, many people have said that this problem exists, but it's like mainstream is just kind of pretends it's not there,
Hmm.
and we oftentimes in Canada, we're kind of the thought could be, well, at least we don't live in the US,
Hmm.
and
Yes.
we get lost in that.
That's true. That's very true.
It's a scary thing.
Yeah, it's true. It ends up being quite subliminal or can feel quite subliminal. I noticed in these comments because there's always some type of trolls and there's always somebody stirring the pot in the comments.
Mm.
And a lot of it is, well, it's always the race card. That's the thing that I saw get
Yeah.
posted, right? It's like, oh, the race card is being pulled. And I think it's hard, even for people who are visible minorities, to say, is this definitely an instance of systemic racism, anti-Black, racism, or is this based on other factors?
Mm.
And I think that sometimes that can be difficult for even, visible minorities to really decimate and say, okay, yes, for sure, other than outright, being called blatant racist terms.
Nobody wants to really go around picking a fight, right?
That's it.
Like for the most part, if something does happen, the it's almost like let me just get out of here, diffuse the situation, and get away
Mhm.
from this as quickly as possible.
Yeah,
Uh, but then that has a psychological effect later on,
it does.
and it plays out in our families.
Yes.
It plays out in just how we view ourselves as an individual, and then on top of that, as a community, as a community. I remember as a kid growing up, there'd be some kind of crime that would be reported on the news, and my my aunt and uncle would be like, "Please don't let it be a Black man."
Yep.
I
Yeah.
think many of us we've kind of heard that. I'll tell you, it's last week, and this kind of threw me for a loop. Last week, I was waiting in a very long lineup to get my vaccine.
Mhm.
In front of me was an older white couple.
Mhm.
The gentleman um, was very animated and very candid, and he um, I guess to pass the time, he was making various different jokes, and he made jokes towards women, he made jokes towards gays, he made jokes, and then he made a comment about the lineup being so long, and he knows that the white man's going to get blamed for that one too,
Oh,
and that
wow.
the whole media is demonizing a white man.
Mhm.
And when he said that, I was like, okay, so do I engage?
Mhm. What to do here? There's so many options. Choose your poison.
And what would be the value in engaging? Clearly, this is much very, I don't know, he's probably in his 70s, maybe.
Mhm.
But the fact that he was so comfortable with making these comments,
Mhm.
um, you know, I kind of wanted to look at him and say, that's part of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
For him, historically, it was probably okay.
Mhm. Mhm. Fair.
But then what happens in the wake of that?
Mhm.
For me, I was with my son, and my son kind of looked at me and was like, really, Dad? And I'm like, you know what? What do you do in this situation, right?
Yeah.
Um, but let's talk a little bit about the impact when someone has experienced something like that that's traumatic, and then they
Mhm.
bring it home.
Yeah.
And when they bring that home, and that's going to have an impact within that household if they don't find a way to resolve that, and that can become generational, right? Because that's what generational, well, actually, I should ask you, how do you define generational trauma?
Yeah. I see generational trauma as the way that we pass along our our horrible experiences. We pass it on through our behaviors. We model that through anxiety, through hypervigilance. Whether you are Aboriginal, whether you are, someone who is Middle Eastern, no matter what your ethnicity, when you've been victimized because of the color of your skin, you will then have that awareness and you will then model that to your children. You will model that to your kids.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the strongest ways that intergenerational trauma shows itself is how do we then conduct ourselves outside? What do we then do? When you are a minority, how do you then, do certain things, have manners, make sure you are really showing your manners,
Yeah.
right? That's one thing for sure. I know in the Black community.
Definitely, you have to make sure that you work twice as hard. You have to, like, there's this, it's almost like this extra burden is placed on you because of how society around you is going to look at you or
Mhm.
judge you, or make sure that you're not drawing too much of attention to yourself. Working in the corporate environment it's sometimes it's funny when you're I've been in scenarios where I've been in a room of a couple hundred people and there's only a few people, a minority within the room. And,
Mhm.
and I've had, other Black people say, you know what, okay, we can't all just hang out and talk to each other because
Yes,
what reception's going to look like.
right.
So there's this, all those things plague within the mind. Right. And so,
Mhm.
whether it's for years, within the Aboriginal community, there's been conversations about missing children. There's been conversation
Mhm.
about missing girls. There's been conversations about, um, a lot of the challenges that has gone on with the government, with land rights, with treaties, like so many different things.
Mhm.
And if anybody, the first time I saw a reservation, it blew my mind.
Yeah.
Like it actually, it blew my mind because it really shifted my perception of Canada.
Mhm.
This perception that we all kind of have of, everybody has rights here, and like all this wonderful mosaic quilt that we live in.
Mhm.
The moment I saw a reservation, that went out the window, and it really made me reconsider how I started to view us as a nation, us as one
Mhm.
people. And so they might say something like that, the van attack that happened, that's an isolated incident, but it's might be quote unquote isolated, but it's part of the fabric of what Canada is, unless we start to really come to terms with the reality that that's part of what Canada is, then it's
Yep.
going to be kind of hard to address it. And then the people that's left in the wake, they're the ones that kind of left to pick up the slack.
Mhm.
And the continuous trauma that happens is it's scary. It was amazing to see the coming together, the various different communities to provide support.
Mhm.
Um, but
With the
then
van attack.
yes.
Mhm.
Then it's like, what okay, so what's next as the media moves on to the next story?
Right. Exactly.
You have that child who now has to go through some sort of therapy to be able to deal with the fallout. And how do we heal?
Mhm.
you know that not that's one example, but when you look at various different communities that have been marginalized for so long, and it's kind of like, well, you pick yourself up by your own bootstraps,
Mhm.
then you don't have boots. It's like, how do
Yeah.
you
Right. That makes it tricky.
it makes it very difficult.
Mhm.
um it, we talk about, within Black community, we talk about slavery, and at the end of slavery, nobody gave the old slave masters um, any kind of a therapy to say you need to think differently about
Mhm.
your peers, and nobody gave the slaves any therapy to say you need to think differently about yourself either.
Yes,
So it's a conundrum.
it is a conundrum.
So let's loop this back to what you do, and that
Yes.
being able to help people to address some of these challenges. I would assume it's not that easy.
It is not at all. The my focus is always on the micro. My focus is always on the one-on-one, and what does that look like?
Mhm.
So when I speak to people about marginalization and experiences of racism or sexism, a lot of times people are speaking about it happening in the workplace. So
Yeah.
that's where a lot of conversation that my clients speak to me about, that's where this is ground zero.
Mhm.
So we talk about, okay, what does it look like to, what I say, honor yourself and have a sense of self, and at the same time have self-advocacy,
Mhm.
but by bridging people, not by ostracizing those people, right? I think that that is critical. I had a conversation with a client actually the other day about the difference, their difference, let me preface that,
Mhm.
between being racist and ignorant.
Yeah.
What is the difference between being racist and being ignorant? And do they have the same impact? I think is the biggest question. So, when we look at that and we have conversations with people about, okay, is this an opportunity to have conversation, to communicate? As a therapist, that's obviously my number one, interest is communication.
Mhm.
So that's usually the path that I like to go down is there an opportunity for you to communicate? Is there an opportunity for there to be learning? Both sides.
So when you say racially ignorant, would that be the definition of that would be somebody might do something that they don't, it's almost like they're insensitive. They're not aware that this is something that would come across as being racist.
Yeah, that's how some people define it, I suppose. And that's where I think that there's an opportunity for us to communicate, right? So I can only speak from, specifically my community and say, things like touching my hair is not currently braided, but it's always some type of something. But there's always something happening. Every time people see me, that's also its own thing. But, touching Black people's hair,
Mhm.
is that racist? I have so many conversations around the exoticism that is, seen for minorities, right? It's like, oh my goodness, it's so exotic. Is that racist or is that ignorant to
But is
the
it okay if
impact?
I ask first, if I get permission rather than just roll up and put?
With my grimy hands and just start touching away.
But we're laughing about this, but this is I think more so for, well, obviously Black women tend to have more hair than Black guys do, and
Hmm.
some of us anyhow.
Fair.
Um, and so I tend to hear that sort of a comment a lot from Black women that people want to touch their hair, or people just automatically start touching their hair and be oh my god, this feels like all this stuff. And so yeah, it's people say we're so sensitive now,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
And but I don't know if it's that we're so sensitive now, or is it just people are speaking up more
Right.
and saying, you know what, wherein before you might keep your mouth closed and go home and beat up on your kids because of all the madness that happened to you at work
Right.
and cause some other generational trauma, right?
Exactly.
Where
Yeah.
now more people are standing up and saying, you know what, this is not acceptable.
Hmm.
But then the people who are struggling with it are the ones who feel like they might be losing some power.
Yes. Yeah, for
Because
sure.
if you had the ability to do something before, and now I'm saying, yeah, no, you can't do that anymore, then
No.
in your head, in that person's mind, they might be losing a right that they had before
Hmm.
that they no longer have, which is a whole nother level of trauma.
Yes, exactly. It's true. But I think it's those things, right? Like even the hair example,
Mhm.
these are things happening at work. This is like a professional environment, and how do you, as you're describing, what does this do, and what do people, how do people carry this home?
Mhm.
When you experience these type of things, or I know of people who have been called very racial names even within the police force, And
Mhm.
it's like, what do you do? How do you manage that when you get home? And a lot of people don't speak on it. They don't talk about it because of shame. So
Yeah,
that's one of the symptoms of intergenerational trauma, or generational trauma, is shame. There's so much shame. There's so much shame around culture, around language, around identity. And that's a huge thing that happens.
that and that and that obviously can play out in multiple different ways. you know,
Hmm.
whether it's substance abuse, the bottle or other things, or abuse in the home. Like there's so many different ways that plays out, and um, I don't think that there's enough focus or emphasis on looking at what the impact of those things are. So if you grew up in a specific neighborhood, I was listening to a conversation earlier today when they were talking about race-based data on the impact of COVID, and that
Mm.
I think there's only two cities that it's something Canada, Health Canada was asking all the provinces for cities for, but only two cities, I think, in all of Canada provided that information. And
Hmm.
one was Toronto, and I forget what the other one was, but in Ontario. And so the conversation was, well, there are certain things that COVID has highlighted within certain communities. So, for low income communities, they had a lot of hotspots because
Hmm.
most of those folks, they didn't have the job that they can work from home.
Right.
They had to go in and work, and they didn't have sick days. So if they didn't have sick days and they weren't feeling well, they have to pay the bill somehow. And so they're going to go into work. And then chances are, because they're low income earners, there's more than one of them living in the household who are doing the same type of work. So if one of them gets sick, they've got 4, 5, 6 different people who are coming down with COVID at the same time. And so, COVID has highlighted a lot of things that I think what they call more marginalized communities have been highlighting for years, but without any race-based data or community level data, it was hard to be able to quantify those things. And it always feels like if you raise a red flag and say there's a problem, it becomes this big journey to have to try to prove
Hmm.
this thing when there's already so much evidence
Yes.
to go along with it. And so in situations like that, it just re-traumatizes the individuals, because if you're, there's 4 or 5 of you in a household and in low income neighborhood, and you have to go to work and one person gets sick and you don't have a choice, you have to go to work.
Hmm.
Now you're dealing with not only, trying to pay the bills, now you're trying to deal with being sick. Now it just all compounds
Hmm.
and plays out in again, through trauma. And then you have children in that environment, and what's that child growing up and seeing? And this is one thing I would love for us to spend some time talking about, and that is, children that are growing up in that environment, and they're seeing the trauma that their parents are going through, no matter how well their parents might be trying to hide that.
Hmm. Yeah.
you know Maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Hmm. I think this is the part where, I'll see it even in different contexts. For instance, what's called health anxiety, where, I'll see someone who grew up in a home where their parent had health anxiety, and so they were checking the expiry dates, in the fridge on all the food all the time.
Okay.
And so, like I said, that hypervigilance. So what does this look like? Does this look like, that parent, being a little bit more strict with that child to say, I don't want you going out that late. I don't want you, doing these things, because it comes from a place of worry,
Mhm.
even more worry for that child's safety, more worry for that child being, the one who's going to be picked out of that group of kids to be arrested or be the fall guy and all those things. So absolutely, that those children in those homes are going to find themselves being like, okay, I need to look at the world differently than maybe my peers do. I need
Mhm.
to, I may see myself as being even more different than I feel.
And so the long-term effects of that,
Mm-hmm.
when a child is in that environment growing up, and then they hit teenagehood, and now they're starting to find their own independence, hopefully,
Mm-hmm.
and they've got these things in the back of their mind that they're hearing from or seeing, from their parents. They're hearing this all this extra pressure.
Mm-hmm.
That's gonna continue that cycle, right?
Yep.
That's going to continue that level of uh,
Fear.
yeah, fear. It's interesting to me
Mm-hmm.
that um, one of the people that was being interviewed on I think it was CBC after the van attack last week, the week before. Um, it was interesting how this gentleman, white guy, had said that he's walks the street all the time, and he now realizes that he has never had to think
Mm-hmm.
about some of the things that he's realizing some of his neighbors have had to think about.
Yep.
He's never had to think about being stopped by the police. He's never had to think about, is somebody going to, based on how I'm dressed or whatever, is somebody going to try to hurt me or my family or anything like that. And I thought it was for me, hearing him say that, I'm really realizing that he was going through a profound transformation in his thinking,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Um, but for most of us, people of color, like
Mm-hmm.
that's the reality that we live every day.
Yep.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
that's the reality that we live every day. That knowing that we're going to be under a certain level of scrutiny,
Mm-hmm.
more so than someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that's and it's a heavy burden to carry. And I'm hoping we can solve it in the next 30 minutes.
Absolutely. Problem solved. I have the recipe right here. No
Yeah.
problem.
Um, but when people come to you and they're talking to you about this weight
Mm-hmm.
that they're carrying, that
Yep.
and sometimes they may not even realize that they're carrying that weight, or
That's a
what
bigger one.
or what the impact of that weight is on their shoulder, on their family, you know, on their circle. What are some of the things that you do with them to help them to, you know, come to terms with that?
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing is awareness.
Mhm.
A lot of times when people come from visible minority communities, there is, there's, don't quote me, but there's kind of four approaches in terms of intergenerational trauma that's been researched in terms of response. Numbness is one.
Mhm.
I don't like this term, but victim is another. There's two more I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's like there's some people that have that numbness response, and they're just like, well, this is the skin I was born in, and this is my life, and here I go, and it's normalized,
Yeah.
allegedly, but it's not really normal. There's
Yeah.
nothing normal about it, and it doesn't feel good. So a lot of times, one of the things that people definitely don't like about therapy is my job is to say, oh, let's open up all these curtains, all these doors, all these things that are behind there that you're trying to pretend aren't there. And let's explore them. Because if you truly don't feel anything towards it, then me talking about it isn't going to be a big deal.
Mhm.
So, the first thing that I do is to say, okay, why don't we explore this topic? Do you think that being the only, a person of Muslim faith in your, workplace, do you think that that impacts your interactions with other people?
Mhm.
What does that do? How does that impact you? What about on the street? Do you worry that your neighbors think something about you? Do what are those little subliminal thoughts and feelings that we don't pay attention to?
Mhm.
So awareness is definitely the first part.
The understanding the it's like, so you're the only black person or Muslim person or Asian person in a room. All of a
Mhm.
sudden you become the spokesperson.
Right. Yes. That's it. Yeah.
You become the spokesperson all of a sudden.
Hmm.
And for your entire group of people,
Community. Yeah.
your entire community, you're now the spokesperson.
Mhm.
And nobody stops to think about, hold on a second, that's a heck of a lot of weight to carry on one person's shoulder.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
true.
so I'm a funny story. I have lots of friends who are DJs, but this one particular friend of mine was DJing a wedding, and I was giving him a hand, and he had these back in the day with records. You have crates, so
Yeah.
he's carrying a few crates of records, and one of them had. Like he had different labels on different crates, color codes, all this stuff. But one of them had a white label and it said white on it.
Mhm.
And so I picked up the crate, didn't really think too much about it, and brought it into the venue. And when I put it into the venue, um, the label white was facing out, and um, and so we were there doing our thing, and he's DJing, music's playing great, everything, and it was predominantly white audience that he was playing to. And then guy comes up and he looks at us and he's like, hey, what's with the white crate? Is that where you keep all your white music?
No.
This was a white guy. And so I looked at that, and it actually was where he kept music that he knows that would work for his wide audience.
Oh, okay. So this wasn't cliche.
So
Okay.
it wasn't cliche. But what I thought was really interesting was if it had said black or Indian or anything else,
Mhm.
I'm pretty sure would not have gotten the same response. But the moment that, when we look in society, it's even to the description of the gentleman who committed the crime against that
Mhm.
family. He was just described as, a 20-year-old male.
Right.
But if it was the other way around, it'd be 20-year-old black male,
Mhm.
or Muslim man or whatever, right? So we live in a society wherein we are the other, and it was almost like the comment was like, "How dare you put us in a box?"
Mhm.
And when that happened, my friend looked at me and goes, "Oh man, I forgot to tell you to turn that around," because that had
Yep.
happened to him before. But it was such a real, I don't know, example of society that we live in, that everything is other,
Mhm.
and and the norm is this, and if you don't fit within that norm, then you're going to get that extra scrutiny,
Yeah.
or you can expect that there's going to be whatever.
Mhm.
And um that's a bitter pill sometimes to swallow.
Mhm.
you know you were saying before, being able to help people to sort of come to terms with the reality that they're facing this thing,
Mhm.
that they're othered, when the person is just trying to be just another person. you know
Yes. I'm just trying to be me.
I'm just
Yeah.
trying to be me. I'm just a human being just like everyone else, but I'm an other, and that's an uncomfortable place to be. And just watching what that response was really hide it. At the time, I never really thought about myself as an other,
Mhm.
but that really, watching his reaction to that really made me stop and think for a second. Hold on, why is it okay
Mhm.
for me to be placed in a box, for me to be prejudged, for me to be whatever,
Yeah.
um, but not you,
Mhm. Mhm.
you know?
Yep.
And that how that plays out in our lives. There's a lot of young, angry men on the streets, young, angry women on the streets because they've been othered.
Yes.
And you know, so what's the second thing that you help people to when in this process to sort of get them through the other side?
Mhm. Yeah, so the first one's definitely awareness, really coming to say, like I say, opening up those cupboard doors and all the places that these feelings are hiding. So definitely being aware of it. The second one is we're looking at, okay, how do we communicate? it's back to that communication, right? So it's like if I feel that I've been othered in whatever scenario, and like we talked about, that razor's edge, right, can be there sometimes. What are my options? There's got to be options for me to communicate this. And
Mhm.
so, looking at the fact that we are not stuck, we do not have to be in a position, no matter what your background is, but you do not need to be in a position where somebody has the upper hand over you. You do have that fortitude, you do have that strength, you do have that opportunity to speak and self-advocate. And so that's number two is communication, self-advocacy. What can you do to make sure that you don't kind of numb it out and, bring it home and don't say anything, but that you actually do something, obviously not violence. I'm not saying like go and fight somebody, but that we do something with those feelings.
It's interesting to me that the groups that have been othered, it's not like those groups are saying we're going to treat you the way that you treated us.
Mm-hmm.
It's always been interesting to me that the you go any place on the planet where there's a native community, the struggle seems to be the same. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you go any
Yep.
place on the planet where Black folks have been ever immigrated to, forcefully or not,
Mm-hmm.
it's the same. And the conversation is always, I just want to be treated like everyone else.
Yep.
The conversation is not every minority ganging up against,
Right.
because
Yeah.
we wouldn't be the minority anymore, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me that it's the conversations that the Native community has been trying to have for hundreds of years is just treat us like we're human beings.
Right.
And that narrative is, it's hard. I can understand why it is somebody would come out of that and feel less than.
Mm-hmm.
I can understand why it is that many of the struggles that these all these communities face.
Mm-hmm.
What I struggle with is understanding why it is so difficult. So we can talk about from the flip side of that. If for people who, it's almost like it turned a blind eye. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
They're not able to see or have that compassion or empathy, or I don't know. Maybe you have a better word for it.
Yeah, like I say, I'm always, reading comments and watching the back and forth that happens. And then I'm always listening to that back and forth anyways. And, what I find really interesting is that, people from white communities, because white is not, homogeneous, there's, Caucasian communities. A lot of times, what I hear is, yes, but that wasn't me though.
Hmm.
I didn't do that.
Hmm.
I am not the one who did these things. And so, why am I being lumped into this group also? Why am I being lumped into the group of colonizers
Yeah.
if I'm not the one who did that? So I think that it's this, it's kind of the opposite experience of anything generational, right? So I find that a lot of people who are visible minorities and have been marginalized in our marginalized communities have that trail of generational trauma. And I find a lot of times that people in the communities that are Caucasian may have the opposite effect, where it's like absolutely severing the ties from
Hmm.
that generational experience. Where it's like, well, I don't personally own any slaves, nor did I, own a boat to bring anyone over. And
Hmm.
it's like, good news, I'm glad for that. That's good. But, at the same time, what do we do with the pain that is everywhere? There are bodies of babies being dug up as we speak all
Yeah.
over Canada
Yeah.
from residential schools where these children were brutalized.
Yeah.
And so you didn't do it. I didn't do it. But does that mean that we don't, as a community, have a responsibility and accountability to help our fellow humans heal?
Hmm.
And I think that's where it gets lost, is this
The-
idea of blame.
yeah, because it's easy for me to detach myself from it if I'm able to say, well, that was them.
Right.
I wasn't there. It wasn't me. That was them. But then
Mhm.
I'm benefiting from the foundation that was built by them that
Right.
I'm saying I'm not.
Right. Exactly.
And the trauma that someone else is dealing with, you know, the opposite of benefit, I guess the deficit that the other is facing is based on, you know, but them who built this on their
Exactly.
backs.
Yep.
And, you know, that is that is a hard thing
Mhm.
for, you know, that gentleman who was, you know, kidding around about everything being blamed on the white man, and that it's the media that's doing it and all this sort of stuff. Um, his ability to be able to, I guess, see past himself and his own experience,
Mhm.
um, I can clearly say is challenged.
Yep.
Because if it wasn't challenged, some of the statements that he was making about women with his wife standing there,
Mhm.
you know, um, it, it, it blew my mind. But the level of, I don't know, privilege you want to call it or whatever, that he had to feel that he could speak that freely and there not be any recourse.
Yep.
You know, goes back to, you know, that what the opposite side of the trauma that some people face.
Mhm.
Um, okay, is there another step in your program?
I forgot. So yes, of course. So first we look at awareness.
Mhm.
Then we look at communication, which involves self-advocacy. In cognitive behavioral therapy terms, this is called assertiveness training. That's what that's called for anybody listening who knows about the, the jargon behind it.
Mhm.
Um, so we look at communicating. We look at emotional regulation. So we look at what is our emotional state and how does that relate with other people, right? So actually what you were speaking about in terms of this gentleman in the line, right?
Yeah.
Did he have any pulse on the fact that his statements could have been really hurtful to his wife, to anybody listening? So, evidently not. It doesn't sound that way.
His wife was just kind of like, here we go again.
Yeah, she's heard it. She's heard it over and over again.
Heard it before.
Yeah. And that's the thing, right? And that's what I mean about, we can say as people from the Black community that, you know, what are the things that we're benefiting from Indigenous people, bleeding their own blood and being tortured and murdered, for everything that, like you say, we are currently profiting, like being in Canada and having these things, right? It's like, what is our own awareness of that pain in
Mhm.
that community? How do we show that? How do we become empathetic and understanding towards that pain of other communities? I think that's important.
Do you think things are shifting?
It's always a tricky question. That's a tricky one. You know, I don't believe that things happen on a broad scale.
Hmm.
I just don't. I don't think that things happen like that. I really think that they happen on very minute by minute, second by second interaction. I think if things are shifting, then tomorrow we are going to see that a whole bunch of textbooks in our schools have been burned, and a whole bunch of them have been replaced with a bunch of that mosaic you were speaking about.
Yeah.
The history's there and
Yeah.
the contributions there. I think
It's
if
not
we're to
just
see,
relegated to, you know, Aboriginal Month or Black History Month.
right, exactly. It's like, let's make this important for a day and then it's no longer important.
Yeah.
That's when I would see shifting. If I were to say, do I right now feel like there's a shift, to answer frankly, I'll be honest, no. And that's very sad and that's disheartening.
Mm.
But the truth is, no, I don't. Like I say, if I started to see all of these people who were internally motivated to be like, you know what? we need to make some serious changes. I feel compelled to
Hmm.
burn these books and make a new one and start instituting this, that there needs to be these changes in the legislation and whatever. Then I would say, you know what, I think we're shifting. But in this moment, not yet.
Hmm.
Not yet. Not to be Debbie Downer, but
Yeah, I was hoping for a little, just a glimmer,
inspiration.
just a glimmer of hope, something.
You got Debbie Downer instead.
I know, it's just a little.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna give just a little,
Oh,
and then
good.
um, I don't like much like you. I don't think that there's the shift is on a mass scale
Hmm.
perspective like that. Um, but I think that the experiences are so much more in the forefront of
Hmm.
people's minds now more than ever
Yeah.
that there's hope. If
Hmm.
if you know, um, yeah, I think for me, I'm looking at this. I'm like, for the first time, I'm like, you know what? I could see, because it can't be denied anymore.
Hmm.
It was easier when there weren't so many cell phone cameras for things to be swept under the rug.
Yeah.
It was easier, for things to be sort of tucked away. But the more voices that are standing up and the more imagery is coming out and the more awareness that is happening, it's kind of like, okay, this tsunami is coming,
Hmm.
and it can't be denied anymore. When before it was a lot easier to, you're just overreacting. Oh, I
Hmm.
just touched your hair. Not that big a deal. You want to touch mine too? You
Yeah.
know?
Not really. No,
Yeah, no, I'm good. Thanks.
I'm good.
But I think there's more, that more awareness that is coming out. It's
Hmm.
causing more people to say, hey, we really, for the first time, I heard a politician say, in a white politician in Canada say that we have to come to terms with the reality that you know these terrorists live among us and they are
Hmm.
part of us, and we need to do something about it. For the first time, I heard that, and I thought, if it's a political ploy that he was making to the populace, that's a pretty big statement to make.
Yeah.
When you have other politicians saying, "Oh, there is no systemic racism in the country,"
Right. Hmm.
you know what I mean? So I'm a little bit hopeful.
Good.
Just just maybe a little bit more than you.
Don't get me wrong. I do have hope. It's not that I am hopeless.
Yeah,
I'm not a hopeless therapist. Let's not advertise that. She
yeah,
she
no,
has no hope.
that would not be a good thing.
No. I
Okay.
think it's more, where I put my money.
Yeah.
I put my money on this. I put my money on honest, difficult conversations where, like I say, I have some people who don't even touch these conversations with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah.
I put my money on these things. That's what I put my money on because I think this is real. This isn't contrived. This isn't like, for any specific purpose other than, education and communicating and community.
Mhm.
So this is what I put my money on. These type of things.
So that honest, open dialogue that needs to be there,
Mhm. Yeah,
wherein people are listening, and not with the intent to troll, but
exactly.
the intent to try to understand.
That's it.
And I agree with you with that, in that those conversations really need to be had, and people do really need to know that they're heard. We've
Mhm.
got Okay, so we've got 8 minutes left. So is
Yeah.
there another step in your, how many steps program is this? 15, 30?
Not
I'm
quite, not quite.
assuming that
Uh,
there's no limit to the how many steps there are. It takes as many as it takes for somebody to get through the process.
yeah, and sometimes we're going forward, we're coming back, we're going forward, I'm going back.
Mhm.
So after, emotional regulation, people can refer to it as emotional intelligence. We really look at community. So even, within my practice, I really encourage, people at some point to bring a kin member in to their session,
Mhm.
because it can't just be about you making changes for you, because that's not how life works. So we can all individually go to therapy, sure, but then if we're not making changes in our relationship with other people, we're not really making that much change. It's just like me alone, but we're not really doing anything expansive.
So
So the
now I'm
next component is relationship.
I got to be fighting with the other people who are still broken.
Yes, exactly. That's the plan. That's it. Yes, that's the idea. Stir it up a little bit.
So
Yeah.
yes, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. It's all good. Yeah, that, I think it's so important that we begin to really reach outwardly, and
Mhm.
we say, okay, that sense of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that love and belonging and that community, and really building those bonds and those relationships with people, strengthening relationships with people. When we talk about intergenerational trauma, you know, there's trust has been absolutely broken.
Mhm.
And how do we learn to trust ourselves, which is pinnacle, that's number one, but then also learn to co-create trust with other people? How do we do that? How do we depend on those relationships?
Yeah. Being able to trust other people when you're still struggling with trusting yourself based on the struggles that you went through
Hmm.
is probably not an easy thing.
It is not. It is not at all. That's why it's closer to the end.
And it's not even something that we even probably even are aware of
No.
that we're struggling with.
Yeah, it is true. It's one of those things, right? I think it really ties in the whole topic of today's, radio cast today. I think it's this idea of how are our communities affected? How do we heal? Was one of the questions that you asked. It's like, what do we do? We need to connect with each other. We really need to connect with each other. We really need to partner with each other. We need to understand each other. And
Yeah, you know, connecting with each other, I think is a must. But I also do think that, in what you were saying, that you would need to see to have really to have that hope that things are changing on a mass scale. I think that we, all the communities need to sort of start to stand up and push back and say, look, the textbooks do need to change.
hmm.
The school curriculum does need to change.
Yeah.
You know, they the workplaces, they do need to change. I think that just and I think we've been sold this for so long that it's like, oh, we got to fix ourselves and we got to focus on us, and which I totally believe that we need to do. But I think we need to start to demand a seat at the table,
Hmm.
and ensuring that our voice are heard.
Hmm.
And whether I've had a lot of people who've not been my fan because I said, what, I don't entirely believe in Black History Month
Hmm.
because to me it's just a token,
Yep.
and we should be demanding a full seat at the table with everyone else,
Hmm.
and it shouldn't just be the European history that's taught.
Yep.
From that perspective. Talk about the genocides as opposed to it being these heroes.
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know, um, we've got like 3 minutes left, and
Yeah.
yeah, we didn't solve it.
No, not yet. Well, I think we talked about what are some possible paths there.
Hmm.
How could we get there? How could we make changes to the next generation now? Do they need to still live with this level of looking over their shoulder and, making sure to put their hood down, and making sure to not speak their language in front of others in case it ruffles any feathers.
Mhm.
Do we have to, import that on our kids, or can they live something different? I think they can.
I think they can too. So Valerie, again, how can people find you? They want to connect with you and have more of these conversations on a one-on-one or group setting.
Yeah, so my practice is called Life Restoration Counseling Group. So you can Google us, for sure. You'll find us there. And our website is www.liferestoration.group.ca.
It's always a pleasure having you coming in and hanging out with me. This was a big topic. Uh,
Yes.
it's relevant given a lot of the things that's happened in the last 2 years.
Yeah,
um,
fair.
a whole lot of things have been brought to the surface, and I was saying before that I have a little bit of hope that the more that the more awareness that there is the more shift that there has to be. And we talked about a whole lot of things today, but being able to look at ourselves and figure ourselves out and figure out the impact of whatever traumas that we've gone through, what we've experienced from our parents, and how we've
Mhm,
passed it on to our children is very important for us to be able to do that. But also along with, fixing ourselves, healing ourselves, getting therapy, getting counseling, along with doing that, we need to start to push an agenda that we need a seat, an equal seat at the table. And it's really easy for us to do our own thing, our own Black awards and own Black this and own Black that.
mhm.
But along with celebrating ourselves, we definitely need to demand that seat at the table. I want to thank you very much, Valerie, for hanging out with me. Those of you online, thank you guys for hanging out with me this evening. And I've been Patrick O'Morris. This has been Black Habit Show. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello there, this is Benjamin Clementine and listen to iLiveRadio.com.
Hey, what's up, Toronto? My name's Bosco, and you're listening to iLive Radio.
This is Dwight Drummond from CBC News Toronto, and you're listening to iLive Radio.
Hey, what's going down, man? It's your boy Trix.